Good morning. Today we have the real chance to attend the lecture of Professor D.Naughton, who is a professor of biomolecular sciences and interim dean for research of the Faculty of Sciences at the Kingston University of London. Professor Naughton has a pioneering work on measurements of immunoreactive origin, and he and his team have developed a specific method to measure about 10 metabolites of vitamin D. I will just make a little joke with his name. At our wedding ceremony with my wife, we had chosen the song Declan of Gary Moore for the initiation. So, and everybody was really surprised. I'm sure that Professor Naughton will take the initiative to introduce us into areas really interesting and surprising.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to your wedding I didn't know about. I'm very pleased to be here today in this beautiful city for the second time at this Congress to talk to you about the work of my research group on vitamin D, and that work is also largely complemented by the work that has been done and contributed by my Greek colleagues, many of whom are in the audience. Really the focus of my talk is encapsulating much of what was said yesterday. We've been working very hard on vitamin D for many years, and as every year goes by, we have more questions than answers. Vitamin D is, on the face of it, a straightforward molecule. In terms of my talk content, I'm going to talk about progress on vitamin D research, the case to improve the measurement capacity, which certainly many of us and myself consider to be a major hindrance to the field in the past. And then in part two, I'll be looking at questions that can be addressed with advanced assays, and also extending the field by using the advanced assays to more forms of vitamin D to help us to fully understand the vitamin D metabolome. There is a possibility that vitamin D is like an iceberg at the moment, and we're only seeing a small proportion of what is happening in the body with vitamin D. And partly the reason for that is for many years we weren't able to analyze a large number of the metabolites. So it may be, and we haven't got there yet, it may be that when we study the full metabolome of vitamin D, we start to see it as a very different molecule, perhaps a molecule like a steroid, where small changes in the structure make large changes to the physiological activity. On the face of it, vitamin D, rather straightforward, activated by the sun in tree form, ingested by food. Circulating form is the one we normally measure, which we saw yesterday, as the D2 and sometimes the D3, and then it's activated and has a plethora of biological effects in health and preventing disease. That, however, is not the full picture. Measuring the circulating forms has not got us very far over many years, and that's largely because we did not have the assays to accurately measure them. But in addition to that, we have queries about how satisfactory is it to take one blood measurement? How satisfactory is it to give somebody a supplement in their 50s and expect it to change a disease like Alzheimer's disease when that person has had 9 months in the womb, perhaps is vitamin D deficient, and then 50 years is vitamin D deficient? Can we just change that overnight with a tablet when they hit 50? These are some fundamental questions I believe have still to be answered. So in terms of the clinical areas of research, many researchers believe low endogenous levels lead to impaired health, reproduction and growth, and contribute to disease onset or progression. Another strand of research is that supplementing with vitamin D will counter these effects. If we look at the amount of research being conducted on vitamin D, it has escalated to about 6,000 publications per year. Of these publications, a large number are in biochemistry and medicine, about 75%, and a large number are full articles with a good number of reviews. So despite all of this research, globally, by very leading research groups, we still have, as we saw yesterday, a great number of questions about what vitamin D is doing, how it works, what is the target level that we should be looking for, even what to measure, whether there's a target level for different diseases. This is a slightly complicated slide, published in 2010. It's a systematic review of all of the reviews of combined studies through all of the different conditions for 20 years leading up to 2010. So without going into the details, it covers cardiovascular, kidney, cystic fibrosis, falling, hypertension, diabetes, mortality, risk of fall, etc. Without going into the details, there are very few cases where there's anything like a positive outcome. And even where there was a positive outcome, it was a very minimal example of a benefit. So some 300 to 400 studies really showed us very little. So having been commissioned to write this review, myself and my research group started to think about why this could be the case. And one of the key issues we felt that was present was that we did not have accurate assays for vitamin D. Most of the assays were based on ELISAs, and the structures of the various analogues of vitamin D are very similar, so you wouldn't automatically expect an ELISA to discriminate between them. If we look at vitamin D3, its precursor form, activated in the skin, hydroxylated in the liver, dihydroxylated in the kidney, these are very similar molecules for a lot of ELISAs to discriminate against at the time in particular. We also have another set of molecules from vitamin D2, giving us numerous molecules with very similar structures. And then we have the epimers, where we have a different form of the molecule, stereo form of the molecule at this position, both in terms of the circulating D3 and the circulating D2. And we also have that for the activated form. So we have yet another 4 molecules to add, none of which had been measured satisfactorily at the time, and most of which had been picked up by the ELISAs that were measuring circulating forms of vitamin D. So fundamentally, the measurements were completely inaccurate. So we started to develop, and this was published in about 2012, we started to develop one of the early liquid chromatography mass spec models, where we looked at, here's just a test sample of 5 subjects, and you can see immediately that some have large amounts of the epimer and large amounts of an isobar from cholesterol metabolism that does affect a mass spec assay. And we can see that the variances are enormous just in these 5 people. So in subject number 5, we have absolutely no epimer or isobar. In subject number 3, 55%, over half of our reading in subject number 3 is actually from interference and not actually from what we were expecting to measure, which was the 25-OHD2 and the 25-OHD3. So in part, we believe that this was starting to show why all of those considerable number of intervention studies were not showing us anything whatsoever. The picture has improved, I'm glad to say, since then, as some of these assays developed in our lab and in other labs have been promulgated around the world and more people are using them, but not routinely as far as I'm aware. So there's clearly a need to enhance our understanding of the assays, but also for the application of the assays in the clinical setting. In addition, and we heard quite a bit about this yesterday, in addition to having a fully accurate assay, we also need to have a target for what we expect to be the level that we find in the blood of our patient, of our subject, etc. And we did have a very good discussion about that yesterday as the last session in the afternoon. But we do have a lot of discrepancy in thought about what are the target levels that we should be looking for. And when we did, although I'm not talking about this today, when we did a sample study of clinicians and other healthcare workers, they were even more confused than people in this room might be about what this means and what these targets should be. So what level is required for each condition? We further developed our assay to measure 10 forms, as we heard in the introduction, and we found that when we look at the ratio of the circulating form to the active form, in mothers, the ratio is about 230 times the circulating form to each molecule of the active form. In healthy people, it's over 1,000. In type 1 diabetes, it's 15. In Alzheimer's, it's over 1,000. And rheumatoid arthritis is about 400. And for the D2, we see a similar pattern, but not so pronounced. So it would appear that we have quite an availability of the vitamin D circulating form in the blood, but it's tightly regulated in terms of conversion to the active form, which you would expect, because we expect that to be in the tissues and not in the blood so much. So we do feel that there is careful bioregulation of the active forms, which may give us messages about giving supplementation. How is that affecting the bioregulation? If you give a supplement of vitamin D, what is that doing to the vitamin D binding protein? If you don't have enough vitamin D binding protein, what happens to the supplemental vitamin D? Does it get carried around the blood? Does something else happen to it? Further, we developed the assay to 10 forms, but even then, using this assay, we are still dependent on a blood sample. A blood sample can have a large range of variables, season, diet, sun exposure in the last few days, etc. And studies based on blood tests, often single measurements, are fallible. So we started to look to see was there an alternative. So towards the end of the first part of my talk on the assays, we started to think about using hair as a matrix. So hair is used as a matrix in things like anti-doping tests, in drug tests for parental custody of children, and even drink driving tests in some countries. It's well known now to be used to look at the adherence to medication. Basically, they can take a hair sample. Your hair grows at 1 centimeter per month. If they take a 3 centimeter hair sample, they can measure the amount of drugs you've had in the last 3 months, the amount of nicotine, the amount of alcohol, etc. So looking at a hair sample, the benefits of this approach would be there's no risk of infection. It's not a biological fluid. It's easy to transport to a specialized laboratory that could have an apparatus to do 10 analogues of vitamin D that you might not have in your local hospital. And one test could cover almost half of a year. So we developed this approach by taking hair closest to the scalp and taking 3 centimeters and then digesting the hair carefully and analyzing for vitamin D by LC mass spec. And what we found were in a sample of 77 young university students, 36% male, that in December, March months, so we took this sample in March, the level we found was exactly more or less half of what we found at the end of summer. And this was not unexpected, but clearly taking a blood sample would have a major effect on any clinical study based on when the sample was taken. And again, that's not novel to you, but this just reinforces that there may be another way to take our sampling for vitamin D where we could get 3, 5, 6, 7 months. And we could even segment our hair strands so we could break it down by the different months and see how the vitamin D layers are going. Obviously, there's more work to do in order to make this a clinical test, but it's certainly one of the directions that we're moving now when it comes to developing the assays for vitamin D. So in terms of the first part of the talk, I believe there's been a lot of very good progress in our labs and other labs measuring very accurately levels of vitamin D, but also thinking outside the box of different ways to measure them rather than just taking an expensive blood test. In terms of part 2, I'm going to look at some of the questions that we could address with these advanced assays, and also how we could extend the field to more forms to help us understand the full vitamin D metabolome. So that might include some clinical aspects, but also some basic biological and fundamental pharmacological effects, which might be very useful for research in the future. So in terms of advanced assays, one of the key questions I have certainly is there biological activity in these analogues? You know, there's 10, 12, 25 vitamin D analogues floating around your body at the moment. How many of them are biologically active? Do they have subtle differences in their biological activity in cells? And is that controlled? Is there a potential for these analogues to have a regulatory role? Would some of the analogues affect the enzymes that are involved in the activation, the hydroxylation, or the catabolism of the forms present of circulating vitamin D? Do they affect the vitamin D binding protein? Do they compete for the binding site? Do they stick to the binding protein? And do they affect binding to the receptor, or do they themselves bind to the receptor? So these are some of the questions that have come onto the horizon now with the advanced assays that we have in place. And this is going to form part of the final part of my talk. So if we look at the papers on the vitamin D and the epimer in Scopus, and this was done a few days ago, we can see we're on about 70 papers per year. Now, I've already shown you that most of us have vitamin D, and a lot of us have a considerable amount of vitamin D, or sorry, most have vitamin D, but most have vitamin D epimers in our body, and a lot of us have a considerable amount of both forms of the epimers. But yet, it's only something like 70 papers out of 6,000 on vitamin D mention the epimers, and even fewer papers mention the other analogues. So there's a whole vast area, and this is what I'm thinking when I'm talking about the bottom of the iceberg that's under the water. There's a whole vast area that we haven't yet mined in terms of research on vitamin D. Most of these papers are on detection of the levels of the epimers, and they stop at that stage, so they don't go beyond that and the function of the epimers and what they are doing. But there are a few papers that do talk about a role potentially for the epimers. So this paper came out in PLOS 1 a few years ago, and they have a crystal structure with the epimer in the receptor, and they also see biological activity for the epimer. So certainly in a test tube, the epimer does an awful lot in the cell system. In this paper, which we completed with our colleagues in Greece, and we saw yesterday, we wanted to look at the maternal levels of the different forms. So there's the D2, the D3 circulating, there's the Epi2 and the Epi3, and then you can see the active from a slide before. The active is hardly present at all, and we don't see it in the neonate. So we can see the mirror image from the mother to the neonate, including all of the forms apart from the active form 5. So we wanted to look at the determination by maternal contributions on the forms that we find in the neonate. So that was the basis for the study. It has to be said that the study was, we could say abnormal, because we saw this yesterday. Most of the mothers, 85% were deficient or insufficient. But perhaps that's normal, so perhaps there's nothing wrong with this study. That is the normal system, and these were women from Greece. And we see a similar pattern in the neonates. So what we found, 85% of the mothers were deficient or insufficient in vitamin D, using hierarchical linear regression models to see what determined the pattern of forms in the neonate. We found that maternal characteristics explain 12% of the 25-OHD. Maternal 25-OHD explained 32%, but intriguingly, epimers contributed nearly 12%. So there's some role, we believe, of the epimers that determine 12% of the neonate 25-OHD, which is the same as the maternal characteristics. So perhaps overlooking the epimers is not such a great idea, because they seem to be doing something. Extending to another study where we measured 10 forms in subjects with diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and Alzheimer's disease, we were able to find and measure for the first time a new analog of vitamin D. And we found that the epimer for D3 was found in all groups at higher concentration in the disease sample than in the healthy. So the question there is, what's going on with the epimer? It's elevated from 6 to 22 in combined diseases. So using discriminant function analysis on these subjects, we are able to classify Alzheimer's, diabetes, and rheumatoid arthritis to 94.4% using the new form and the epi form alongside the D2, but not the D3. So again, the epimer story is telling us something here. Using a ROC analysis curve for prediction of these three diseases, we found good sensitivity and specificity using the 3-epi 25-OHD. So we can see here the 3-epi, very good classification predictor of disease. And then we have the epi to circulating, and the circulating gives us almost no correlation. So again, it would seem there's quite a story in here with the epimer that has yet to be bottomed out, and most papers on the epimer are at the stage where people have been able to detect it, so they're looking at it in people in their country, in young people, in old people, in sports players, etc. So that's really where the field is at the epimers. And I certainly have a feeling that there's going to be a lot more about that in the next decade. So if we move on to other analogues, this analog has recently been found to be produced in the body. So it's a 120S-OH2D3 as opposed to 125-OH2D3, so it's got the extra hydroxy group up here. It's been found by crystallographic studies to interact with the receptor 120S-OHD2 and 125, very similar pattern of interaction. It translocates to the nucleus following interaction with the VDR. It stimulates the VDRE reporter activity. It regulates VDR downstream genes, and it inhibits production of inflammatory markers. So just a snapshot of some of the other analogues. The two that we found are the epimers, and the other one, the new one that we found, your form, certainly seem to be very useful when we're using statistics to predict disease forms. And this form, the 120, seems to have considerable activity and affinity for the receptor. So in terms of our questions, is the biological activity of the analogues? You know, it may be provocative, but it seems it definitely is. So putting it to one side maybe is not the way to go forward, at least in some research areas. The potential regulatory roles of the analogues, this is something we're looking at in my laboratory at the moment. So we're seeing if we can have an effect for the different analogues in enzyme activation and of other drugs at enzyme activation. Effect of binding to VDBP, well, we believe that is the case, and we've already seen that the analogues can bind to the receptor and activate the receptor in cellular studies. So, in summary, advanced assays have helped us to provide considerable rigor to vitamin D research in the clinical setting and in other settings, and it has opened up new questions about a wider range of forms. A wide range of forms are now measured in growing numbers of studies, which is really quite interesting, and other forms appear to have biological activity, appear to bind to the receptor, and appear to activate the receptor. Advanced assays should be applied, in my view, at least highly accurate assays for any studies. Other forms weren't further studied as potential bioregulators of vitamin D, and a suggestion to try supplementing with varied forms came up yesterday, and certainly it looks like that may be a good way to go. In terms of acknowledgements, these are some of the people who are involved in the work in Aristotle, who is led by Spirus, but with other colleagues, and funding has been from a number of sources. Thank you very much.
Professor Naughton, thank you very much for your thorough presentation. You took us step by step in addressing these very important questions about vitamin D metabolism. We should allow some time for the audience to address questions they might have for you. Professor Chakalov, please.
It's very interesting, and I would like to ask you, because you formulated one purpose, to investigate the regulation of enzymes involved in activation and destruction of the active form. And
That's
I would
what-
like, yes.
That's what we're looking at now,
Yeah,
so I haven't
would
spoken
like
about
to
that,
ask
but
you,
I will next year.
What compounds do you use? It's natural compounds, for example, genistein, or you use some synthetic compounds also discovered for the regulation of these enzymes. So the question is, what is the spectrum? What are you using?
Yeah, we're using two sets of compounds. One set of compounds are the analogues that are available of vitamin D. So we're trying to see if the epimers will affect, etc. And the other is just drugs used in the clinic. So we're looking at a full range of drugs used in the clinic to see if there's any effect.
Yeah, and
foodstuffs.
For the regulation of the enzymes.
Yeah, to see if they inhibit the enzymes, basically.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So just to expand on that, back in 2012, we showed that a number of constituents of red wine and tea inhibit the enzyme that glucuronidates testosterone and considerably inhibits it. So these simple dietary components could affect the levels of testosterone in your blood.
Okay.
Professor Minzola?
Very nice talk. My compliments. Just two questions. When you measured the 25-hydroxyvitamin D in the hair,
Yes.
did you find correlation with serum samples or the results are different?
That's a very good question. It was a pilot study, and we haven't done that, but that needs to be done. I fully agree that we need to be validating it by taking serum samples maybe once every 2 weeks and then measuring. Yep, you're absolutely right, to extend the study. Thank you.
And the second question is, you showed us that the three epimers are increased in some kinds of diseases.
Yeah.
So why you don't consider the fact that, for example, this can be just, sorry for the joke of words, an epiphenomenon? And why do you consider, which are the basis, because this is obviously interesting to me from a clinical point of view, why do you consider that epimers have a biological role?
Yeah.
Which are the basis for your consideration of epimers as important as, let's say, 25-hydroxy-D?
Yeah. Thank you. Very good question again. There are two sides to this. I mean, we set out just to clean up the assay. And then when we started to find the epimers, because at that stage the epimers were found in very young children, but it was believed that that was about it. So we set out just to clean up the assay. And then we started to find the epimers. So we kind of thought, okay, well, that's interesting, but we have epitestosterone, and people don't spend too much time at conferences talking about epitestosterone. So we thought, okay, well, we forget about that for the moment. And then the paper came out showing the epimer had bound to and the crystal structure is bound to a receptor, and it activates the receptor. So from that stage, we started to rethink about our work, and with our maternal neonate study, we could see that the epimers help predict the levels in the baby of the circulating form. So therefore, looking at that, we moved forward to think about whether the epimer could affect, so this is the work we're doing at the moment, whether the epimer could affect the hydroxylation in the liver or in the kidney of the circulating form. So that's where we are at the moment. So that's kind of the road that we got to, but I also mentioned that there were, about 70 papers per year on the epimers, but most of them are simply measuring the epimer. So I think it's really on the precipice, and it could go either way. It could be, well, the epimer is an interesting thing, but it didn't really do a whole lot. Or else, well, actually, it does do a little bit, but it's still only 1% of the story.
Professor Kotza.
To continue in this subject, when you supplement, does this ratio of the epimers change?
I haven't seen a paper on that yet.
You haven't?
No, not yet.
We may do it.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
Professor Giovos?
Has anybody studied vitamin D epimers in vitamin D resistant states?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I think that the field is really, really young at the moment. It's 70 papers a year, and, 25 of them are probably chemical synthesis papers, and then another 40 will be people measuring just levels of epimer because their assay can measure them. So it's really early days. And, you know, I mean, this vitamin D research is one of the research aspects I do in my research group. You know, I'm not one of these people who I can only talk about epimers, but it seems to be something that we're bringing to the conference for open debate. So I'm very happy to have open debate.
Since we have the luxury of time, I think we can allow for a few more questions. Professor Kotsa, what do you think? Professor Tsakalov has one more. Yes.
The main assay, as I realized, you used was LCMS.
Yes.
Yes, that's it. And you separated epimers in LCMS. You used chiral column for the separation of epimers.
We used two columns, normal column and a chiral.
Okay.
That's published. It was published in the back of a JChem paper in 2014. The full, it's basically a paper on the back of the JChem paper, which was on the disease.
Nice work as always.
Thank you.
What do we know? You presented data on the 120S epimer. What do we know about the relative potency just for binding on the vitamin D receptor of the different epimers? You're talking about 10 substances, 8 substances, 5 substances. Why do they exist? Do they activate the receptor the same as vitamin D?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and that's the question that's the answer. That's the answer we're trying to get to, and that's why we're looking at the moment at the enzymes and the activation through the enzymes. But there's very little known apart from these analogues seem to fire the receptor and we get non-inflammatory effects, etc., etc. So that's where we are at the moment. We're not at a stage where we have which one works better, you know, grading them, etc. This is really good, this is really weak, etc. And I think, you know, the next 10 years is going to be really fascinating looking at that. But it's a very good question.
And one last question from Dr.
Just to
Papayan.
continue to what you just answered, maybe selective VDREs?
Sorry, say again?
Selective VDREs? Selective vitamin D receptor response elements?
But potentially, yeah, potentially. I mean, at the moment, it may be an overstatement, but at the moment, as I said, I think yesterday, I'm kind of thinking about vitamin D like the steroids. The steroids have epimer, testosterone. Small changes in where the hydroxyl goes on the steroid has a huge effect on what goes on, anabolic, catabolic, etc.
Okay, so if I'm allowed one final question, or maybe you have another question. From a biologist's perspective, you mentioned that these epimers analogs might have different biological roles. Would you like to briefly describe to us the biological model that you're using for observing differences they might have on the vitamin D binding protein or the receptor? Do you have a biological model?
No, I don't. No,
okay.
No. It's not my area, but I would love it if someone did that.
Okay, because you did mention in one of your slides about the different actions they might have biologically.
Oh yeah,
gene expression alterations.
Yeah, no, I think that would be for the whole field, not just for my group.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.